Hegel's, the account of others and self and others that I'm going to talk about is rather combative. It involves a struggle for recognition. The struggle for recognition is an episode in Hegel's first major work, possibly his only major work, The Phenomenology of Spirit, which appeared in 1807. It occurs in Hegel's account of self-consciousness, which forms the second main section of the book. The first main section was concerned with consciousness, and by consciousness, Hegel means consciousness of objects distinct from oneself. But now he turns his attention to self-consciousness, consciousness of oneself. This transition from consciousness to self-consciousness isn't very easy to understand. For one thing, Hegel says that consciousness and self-consciousness always go together. If we are self-conscious, we're also conscious of objects as well. And conversely, if we're conscious of objects, we're always self-conscious too. So why does he consider self-consciousness separately, leaving consciousness aside? And secondly, the transition from consciousness to self-consciousness is very abrupt. Usually, when Hegel makes a transition from one topic to another, the transition is motivated by some problem which requires the transition for its solution. But in this case, there's no obvious problem about consciousness that requires a transition to self-consciousness. It seems as if Hegel has only turned to a new subject, a new topic, with no apparent motivation. And I think the answer to these questions is this. Hegel believes that in order to understand an object properly, we mustn't be entirely absorbed in the object. We must withdraw from it, take our distance from it in order to bring the object into focus. We must even enter into opposition to the object, distinguish ourselves from it, and develop ourselves independently. Then after this, we can return to the object and fully understand it. This idea occurs frequently in Hegel. It's the pattern of immediate unity, then opposition, and finally mediated unity, sophisticated, developed unity. To take a simple example, which Hegel himself gives elsewhere, a child is immediately and entirely absorbed in its surroundings, its environment. It's not opposed to its environment, it's quite contented with it. But it doesn't have a rational adult view of the world. It thinks of itself as the centre of the world. And self-centeredness is, of course, quite different in Hegel's view from self-consciousness. This is immediate unity. The move to adulthood begins with opposition to the world. The young person believes that the world is out of joint. Everything is wrong and needs improvement, perhaps complete transformation. So he decides to make the world right. But to do this, he or she, it's always he in Hegel, of course, but we'll say he or she here, must develop himself, acquire knowledge, find a job, make money and acquire power. He must, as we say, sup with the devil, compromise with this wicked world. And this eventually leads to a reconciliation with the world as it is, to a deeper understanding of it, a balanced, rational view of the world and of one's own modest position in it. So we begin with immediate, naive unity between self and world. We proceed to opposition between them, and we conclude with mediated, sophisticated unity between self and the world. Restoring unity of self and world, but restored on a higher level, the negation of negation, as Hegel calls it. I should perhaps just interject that he thinks that people die of sophisticated contentment, so one mustn't become too contented too soon. This pattern, immediate unity, opposition, and restored unity, seems to me to underlie the phenomenology of spirit. In the first section, consciousness, Hegel expresses our immediate unity with the world, our unity with the objects of consciousness. In the section on self-consciousness, he expresses the opposition of the self to the world. The self is here opposed to what it is other than itself. It eats it, it fights it, it enslaves it, and so on. It retreats into itself away from the world as a stoic. It denies the reality of the world as a skeptic. And finally, it rises up above the world to remote God, a transcendent deity, as unhappy consciousness. After that, in the next section, reason, it descends again to the world and begins to master it as reason. It brings order into the world by science and by developing its morality and political institutions.